is Rachel, and this is my presentation for outbreak investigation and response. The disease that I focused on was Clostridium botulinum, specifically the outbreak in rural Ethiopia of March of 2015. So let's just get right into it. So the background, as you can tell, looks like bacteria. This is actually what botulism looks like under the microscope. Clostridium botulinum is a heterogeneous group of gram-positive rod-shaped spore-forming obligate anaerobic bacteria. This bacterium produces lethal toxins type A, B, E, and F. And I know that's a whole mouthful, but I focused mainly on type A. It's the most common type of specification of botulism. Beyond that, there are 3 different types of botulism. There is foodborne botulism, there is infant botulism, and there is wound botulism. I focused on this presentation in this specific outbreak. It was foodborne botulism, which is more common than wound botulism. So foodborne botulism is spread mainly through poorly canned foods, like poorly canned homemade foods, and if there is a low acidity, then the spores really thrive and they can reproduce very well. Wound botulism occurs mainly when the spores get into an open wound. It's actually the most common with heroin addicts when they inject specifically black tar heroin, and the spores can travel through there. Also, the last one is infant botulism, which is actually the most common in the US, and that occurs when babies under the age of 1 year old are fed honey and they contract it very easily. Factors that increase the risk of contracting botulism include the general population being uninformed. As we'll see later on in this presentation, the outbreak in Ethiopia occurred mainly because the patients weren't aware of botulism and the risk of it. I've actually asked other people, my peers, and been talking about botulism, and they just kind of looked at me like, what's botulism? And I'm like, okay. So one of the major ways that we fight disease is by educating ourselves. And if the general population is unaware of it or uneducated, then it can spread much more rapidly. Poorly canned and preserved foods, as I've already said, it's extremely common. For canning, homemade canning, it's difficult. I would can with my mom in the summer when I was younger, and it's a stressful process, and it can be dangerous. So it's not always easy for that to be completely safe and completely free of the spores. And a lack of infrastructure, which we don't typically think of, because if you would think of an outbreak in the US, you wouldn't really think of us having a lack of infrastructure, such as good, sewage systems that work well, and refrigeration, and just the basic necessities of life that we would think of. But in this specific outbreak, it was a real problem in Ethiopia because they were unaware, they had a lack of infrastructure, and it really just added up to one big mess. So, um, so we can reduce the risk of contracting botulism by education, as I have already said. You'll notice also in this outbreak that they did educate the population after, just the general public, after the outbreak occurred, because they realized that it was a very large risk. This was the first reported case of botulism in Ethiopia, and I do believe the reason why is because people were just uninformed and they didn't think that it would be a big deal, and by the time that they realized it was a big deal, it was already too late. So this was the first reported case, and it actually turned out to be a blessing that they did report it, because they were able to save some lives and educate the general public. So education is a huge deal when it comes to fighting disease in general. Being more careful when canning or creating homemade foods. These were specifically homemade foods, like one of them was butter, and then the other was cheese, and one was a traditional chili condiment, and it was all homemade goods. And it's most common that the process of making homemade food there can be spores of botulism that get in it, and then they can obviously reproduce and grow, and then the person can get contaminated and they will get the spores in their intestines, and it will just ravage their nervous system. So infrastructure is a big deal. Being aware, and in underdeveloped countries, we don't usually think about, we don't usually think about refrigeration as a big deal, but in these countries it can be a real luxury, and as a result, diseases can travel very fast because mode of transportation is much easier because they're not halted by refrigeration and stuff like that. So this is describing the case that I studied specifically, and in March of 2015, in Western Ethiopia, 10 out of 14 family members contracted probable botulism due to a traditional chili condiment called, forgive my pronunciation, I have no idea how to pronounce this, kochi kocha. I don't know if it's koki koka, I'm not sure, but clarified butter and cheese. 5 of the 10 that contracted the botulism died. The case fatality rate was 50%, and the attack rate of the contracted botulism was 71.4%. Only 3 of 10 were admitted to the hospital. So as you may notice, there are several problems, several issues with this outbreak. One of them being that only 3 of the 10 that contracted the botulism were admitted to the hospital. Botulism isn't something you want to play around with once you get it. It causes paralysis, and it's similar, from what I studied, it's actually very similar to snake venom, in that a lot of snake venom is neurotoxins, and so what happens is the spores that the botulism, so botulism is originally a sporific bacteria, and then it is introduced into a system like your body systems, a wound, and if the conditions are just right and it finds it good, then the endospores will replicate and they will grow into bacteria. These bacteria themselves aren't harmful, but the toxins that the bacteria release are extremely harmful. They attack your nervous system, and they attach onto your nerves, and they just eat them away, and it causes paralysis and several issues, and it's just a big mess. So obviously you can see how if only 3 of the 10 patients were admitted to the hospital, how that would be a big deal, because when you have a neurotoxin, you're obviously going to want an antitoxin. So The mortality rate or fatality rate in this case was extremely high. I researched it because I was curious about the fatality rate just in general, and the fatality rate of botulism is actually much lower because we can usually treat it. It's fairly treatable, but the fatality rate was extremely high in this because I do believe, again, there was a lack of education, and it was difficult for the doctors to determine what was actually going on. So key players in the investigation were the Federal Ministry of Health, Ethiopian Public Health Institute, and the Center for Disease Control. The CDC I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody's heard of the CDC, especially since COVID-19. But the CDC is kind of like the glue that holds everything together. They are based in Atlanta, and they help the whole world kind of come together and really make sure people work together and help control the disease and the outbreak. So they're very important. So what actions were taken to stop the outbreak? Once the 3 family members were admitted to their local hospital, the doctors and hospital staff ran extensive tests and began treatment. One of the many problems with Clostridium botulinum is that it is difficult to diagnose, which with its symptoms you may not think that it is difficult to diagnose because it's fairly on its own, and the tests that confirm it take several days to come back, and so to develop, and then by the time that you get the test back, the patient could possibly already be dead. So what they usually do is, if it's probable botulism, then they will start the tests. If they get a few of the tests back, typically they'll do mice bioassays, which is basically where they take a healthy mouse and they inject it with the food that was consumed by the patient. And if the mouse contracts botulism or any other disease that they think that it is, that will be a point in the right direction that it was indeed the disease they thought it was, and so then they can begin treatment. Because it takes so long to actually correctly diagnose and for the test to come back, usually if it's probable botulism, they will send the test away and then they will start treatment immediately. So they started to run tests on the 3 family members that were admitted, and they began to treat the patients right away. So they did seem to follow the typical protocols, and I think that they did a very, very good job at controlling this outbreak and preventing more people from getting it and treating the patients. And if the doctors hadn't done a good job, then I don't believe that any of them would have survived. So after it was confirmed botulism, the public health officials ordered the family to destroy the food and clean the utensils. This was something I was very impressed by. A lot of times it can be difficult for the public health officials to, once a case is diagnosed, to really take control and set guidelines and say, this is what needs to be done, you need to do this now before it gets worse. And so the family did destroy the food and they cleaned the utensils, and I was very impressed by that action. It was very smart and very well handled. So two of the three patients were treated with botulism antitoxin. These are just 2 of the 3 admitted patients. So not every case is treated with botulism antitoxin, but it is the most common form of treatment for botulism, and it seems to work pretty well. The reason why I associate botulism neurotoxin with the neurotoxin in snake venom is because, similar to the way antivenom is made from plasma of horses injected with the snake venom, their bloodstream then constructs antibodies to fight off the snake venom. And botulism antitoxin was made the exact same way. It was made by injecting the horses with the botulism, and then their body formed these antibodies, and it began fighting off this thing that was destroying its nerves and damaging its body. So it's actually quite similar, which I find very intriguing. What could have been done to prevent the outbreak? The public should have been educated of the risk of botulism. I know that education in third world countries can be extremely difficult, and there's always a risk of people miscommunication and not understanding, but as I've said multiple times before, education is the foundation for preventing disease outbreak and controlling it and preventing it. If more of the patients had been admitted to the hospital, it is more likely that they would have survived. So the death rate in this specific outbreak was 50%, which is fairly rare, and I do believe that if more of the patients have been admitted, then not nearly as many of them would have died, causing the fatality rate to be lower, significantly lower. If the guidelines for food and safety had been observed, it is less likely that the family would have contracted botulism. So there are guidelines for canning and for just basic rules that you need to follow. And it's very obvious that in rural Ethiopia, you're probably not going to have people Googling, how do I can this? You know, they probably learned from their mom and from their mom's mom, and it's a family recipe, especially if it's like homemade butter. So it's going to be less likely that they're going to follow the guidelines because they're going to be very unaware of the guidelines. So in the future, a part of the education would need to be making them very aware of the guidelines and the risks. So in closing, I would say that throughout this amazing class, the one thing I have learned is that the most useful combatant against fighting disease and preventing disease in the first place isn't really, some may say it's sanitation, some may say, you know, it's observing the laws and regulations. And while I agree, if you think back on medical history, they weren't aware of the diseases. They weren't aware of the bacteria, and so people were dying because they didn't realize that they were infecting their patients. The doctors and surgeons were infecting their patients. So simply being educated, being aware, and then following those guidelines once we are educated is a huge, huge deal. Science is ever changing. Oh, I'm so sorry, my earbud just freaked out. Science is ever changing, and it is, it's hard to keep up sometimes, but education is probably the biggest factor when it comes to preventing disease outbreak. And these are my sources and my citations, and that is it. I had a lot of fun researching Clostridium botulinum, and a fun fact about it is that Clostridium botulinum is actually used in Botox. Botulism is known for paralysis, and they inject it in your face to freeze your face. So that's a fun fact that I have learned through this process. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.